Hi, I'm Justin. This is C5 Dev, where inspiration is a chain reaction. In this video, I'm going to use Docker development containers to go through the different implementations of Hello World that are within Polyglot World. So with that said, let's take a look at the code. Here we are at docker-polyglot-world repository. You can find the link to the repository in the description below. In the previous video, I went through docker-polyglot-world and how to run the images that are defined within this repository. In this video, I'm going to be digging into how you can actually do development in docker-polyglot-world. The first one we want to take a look at is the Python implementation. Before I dive into the code, I want to explain why you would use development containers and not just develop directly on your workstation. We have the repository open, and what I'm going to start with is our Python example. So I'm going to expand Python and take a look at main.py. So in here, you can see that VSCode is now, if I hover over here, is saying it can't resolve this import. So that's going to be interesting. Let's try to run this. So I'm going to use the unicorn command. If we open up the python.docker file, I'm going to run the unicorn command to run our instance, our Starlet instance. Unicorn, and it's in the Python folder. In the Docker file, we do the app.main, and that's because we're actually creating an app directory, but that app directory doesn't exist, so we have the Python directory here. Going to do unicorn python.main, and then the colon and app, and run that. And you'll see that there's not even unicorn, so I don't have this installed, and it appeared that I don't have this installed. At this point, I have a decision. Do I want to install the dependencies on my workstation? Or maybe there's a different way to do that. And the different way is the dev containers. I could install the Python packages that are required. So I could install unicorn and Starlet directly on my workstation. But another thing that I wanted to point out is if I take a look at this, before I built this to run on Python 3.11. And if I check the Python version that I have installed, it's actually 3.10. Now those are pretty close to each other, but when you're doing development, you want to have the same environment that you're going to have when this application is going to actually run. Then the other part is, as you start installing different Python packages, you're going to have a large list. So if I do pip list, and pip is the package manager for Python, you can see these are all that are on my machine, and they have nothing to do, or a lot of them have nothing to do with actually wanting to run this application. Now we kind of see the problem. Now Python, there are different implementations out there, PyEnv or Poetry, that can help you manage some of your environments. In Python, they're called virtual environments. But there's another way. Now that we're familiar with how to use Docker, we have Docker set up on our machine. We can use Docker to actually do this development and isolate that. So I want to take a look now at the Python section for developing with Docker containers. This first part here is Python, and I have with OMZ, which is oh my zish, or oh my z shell, if you prefer to call it that way. And then I also have selecting the name of the container. And the other option that I have is with bash. So using Z shell or using bash, and oh my zish or oh my z shell is a complementary package that kind of gives you some other nice components on top of the Z shell. So for my development, I like to use oh my zish. And then the name part is right here, is to define that Docker container gets that specific name. If you don't provide a name section, Docker is actually going to provide a randomly generated name for you, which will work. But for our purposes now, we want to be able to create an environment that we can come back to after we've done some work on it. And that's why I'm using the name here. In the bash example, you can see that I do not use the name, and I'm just starting up bash, so there won't be a Z shell. Before I run this command, just want to show you where this script is real quick. This oh my zish. It's in utilities. We will first run an update, which is the Debian aptitude command. And then we're going to install zish and less. Then we want to change the shell to zish. Then we install all my zish, and then we run zish. I'm going to copy this command, bring it over to my terminal. I'm gonna paste that command, run that. All right, and then it gives me the ID of the container. So if I do docker ps, and you can see the container ID is the first 12 characters of this that it displays. Also, you can look, the name that I provided it is now set here instead of a randomly generated name. So the next part is we want to use an extension of VS Code called dev containers. We're going to go to the extensions and look for dev container, and it is right here. You can see I already have it installed. We are going to be able to use that tool to connect to that Docker container. So I'm going to go into the command section for VS Code. For me, that's Control-Shift-P, and I'm running Ubuntu. Dev containers and attach to running container. I click on that. And then it's going to give me, right now I only have one container running, so that's the only one available. I'm going to run that. That command now starts up a new instance of VS Code, and you can see that it's connecting here. So I'm just going to close this welcome window. On the lower left of the window, you can hover right here and see that it says it's editing in the container, tells me which it is, and then at the desktop of Linux. What I'm going to do now is bring up the terminal. I'm going to type hostname, and you can see there is that Docker container ID. So I am now within the container, and this VS Code instance is running inside of there. Let's head over to the documentation website. We are at the developing inside a container. You can find this link at the bottom of the README in the Inspired By section. You can read through this, and I definitely recommend that you do, but just want to draw your attention to the image that they have available here first. You can see that it has the local operating system, which is going to be your workstation, and then your VS Code instance. And it's telling you that it's using the theme and the UI extensions are handled here, as well as source code. So the docker-polyglot-world repository is on my local machine. So we start up the container with the Docker command, and then you can see here there's also this volume mount. This volume mount is the -v that I have in there, and that exposes the source code repository for my local machine to the file system that is on the container. The VS Code extension actually does this part. So it exposes the port and it starts up the VS Code server for us. And then it handles the workspace extension. It also handles setting up these different elements that allow us to run things as though we were running that on our workstation versus in a Docker container. We are back in our Python 3.11 Docker container. And now I want to open up the main.py. And once VS Code loads some of the components that it needs to, so we still have the import issue. The issue is that if I do pip list, we don't have those packages installed. So let's go over a good thing to check is our Python Docker file. And that's going to tell us some of the things that we need. You can see here, pip install no cache. Oh, I didn't install the requirements. If we open up that file, is where our Starlet and Uvicorn are both defined. So I'm going to close that. So let's install that. So I'm going to do pip install. It's in the Python directory, requirements.txt. And then you also need -r for requirements file. With that installed, now I'll type the command pip list. And now we have Starlet in that. So let's go back to our main.py. And sure enough, now the module has been detected. Now that we have that installed, let's go back to here, and now I want to run the Uvicorn command from before. Uvicorn, and it's going to be in the Python directory this time, main app, and run that. All right, so now I have my server running. VS Code has given me a helpful open in browser button, so I'm going to click on that. All right, in the browser, now I have hello world. If I switch back, you can see I've run that twice, and so it's showing up. Great. So the nice part about this is now I have an isolated environment where I have my Python 3.11, which is going to run the same version that is in my Docker file. The one thing that is different, if I go back to the README, in the README, I just want to take a look and call out here, the version that I'm using is actually Python 3.11.0, but no dash Alpine. If we go back to Dockerfile, you'll see there is a dash Alpine 3.16. If you're familiar with the difference between those two, great. This should be pretty quick. But if you're not familiar with it, I just want to quickly explain kind of the difference. So for that, you actually have two different versions of Linux distributions. And so let's take a quick look at when you would pick one or the other. The first one, it's in the name of the Docker tag, is actually the Alpine Linux. This doesn't have all the desktop tools that you may be familiar with. If you use Ubuntu or if you use Mac, some of the same tools might be on there. This is very narrowed down to really running your application in a container. Now, by default, when there isn't a dash Alpine, most of the Docker images are going to be based on Debian. So if we go over to Debian, as they say on the website, Debian is a complete free operating system. This operating system is going to be most closely to, if you use Ubuntu, what that experience is like. Ubuntu is actually a Linux distribution based off of Debian, so it'll have a lot of the same tooling that you're familiar with there. Then quickly, I just wanted to show you, if we go to Docker Hub, which is where we're going to be pulling all of our images, and if I search Python, and if I go into the Python section, in an overview, simple tags, we can see that there are these Buster ones, there should be Bullseye ones, and those are the versions of Debian. And then you also see down here Alpine. So by default, when you exclude the Buster or Bullseye, you get the latest. Now with that quick little primer over, I actually want to show you how I'm going to modify the Python implementation of this hello world. For the modification of this, I want to add a path that will respond hello world in another language. I want to use GitHub Copilot for this example. So I want to go over to my VSCode extensions and make sure that I have Copilot installed. And it looks like it is already installed. If you don't see the extension that you want to have that installed in your container, do make sure that you click over here. As you can see for this Go example, even though I have this extension installed on my workstation, it's not going to, by default, be installed in the container. So I already have GitHub Copilot and Git Lens, which are two of my development extensions. So I'll go back to the Explorer, close that. So I'm going to just say create function like homepage that returns Esperanto greeting if path. I'm actually going to end there and have to give a little bit of a hint here. All right, tab that, cool. Looks like that's good. And then this is also a GitHub Copilot thing, so I just entered in there and it knows by context. And so I hit tab, and now I have that. I hit save. Let me bring back my terminal, and then it didn't reload, so let's go. I'm going to go to my browser now and try to refresh. All right, and I'm going to put the new path, EO, not found. All right. So the issue is I didn't have automatic reload on. I'm going to do -- reload. And now as I make changes to this, it will change automatically for me. I'm going to go back to the browser and here, refresh. And there we go. And if I go back to the root, it shows me hello world as normal. I'm going to go back to VS Code, change hello world to be hello Justin, hit enter, and you can see with that reload, state reloaded detected, and so it's reloading. If I go back to the browser and refresh, and says, hello, Justin. I'm going to change this back to hello world. And now we have hello world in Esperanto. Something that I quickly covered there was the use of GitHub Copilot. So let's go over to the website for that to just kind of explain that a little bit more if you're not familiar with that tool. At the GitHub Copilot main page, which I have a link to in the Inspired By section in this repository. And this is a very helpful tool because you give it a little bit of a hint of what you want to build out, and then OpenAI's Codex will it'll give you suggestions of code that could be usable for your purpose. For me, when I'm using GitHub Copilot, I use it usually to help me kind of think through and figure out ideas or possible paths. But sometimes it's going to provide you things that are incorrect. You want to make sure that that's the code that you actually want to run. So do make sure to always review the code that GitHub Copilot presents to you. If you haven't used GitHub Copilot before, I recommend checking it out. I use it with VS Code. I think it may only work with VS Code because of the extension. So if you're not familiar with VS Code, you'll have to learn that part first. But it is a very neat tool, and it can give you some very helpful code suggestions. I showed how we modified the Python Hello World implementation inside of this container. And I want to show you that we actually are running this in the container by shutting down the container and then showing you what VS Code will do. So back at the terminal, I'm going to type docker kill, which is going to stop a container, docker and then tab to get the name. I'm going to go back to VS Code. And VS Code says cannot reconnect. Please reload. Let's click on the please reload. And so because the container isn't running, it says it's not available. But the really nice part is VS Code is going to give you this option to start the container. So let's click that. Now it should be available. Let's type hostname. And you can see it started up that same container. Go back to the terminal, docker ps, and it's alive again. We created it 24 minutes ago, and it's been up for 24 seconds. The nice part about that is that that container, even when we shut off our workstation and start it back up, is going to be available, and we can connect to that with VS Code. Now I'm going to do that again, and this time I'm going to stop the container and then close out this instance of VS Code and show how to start the container again without having to run the docker command to run it. I'm going to run the docker kill command. We go back to VS Code and it stops, so I'm going to say cancel because I don't want it to reload. I'm actually going to close this. Back at the original VS Code instance, and this is running directly on my workstation, I'm going to run the docker ps command to show that that container is stopped. Now instead of running the docker run command again that we ran before, we're actually just going to use the docker start command. That'll start the container back up. So I'm going to type docker start and docker and then tab to get the name. Do that. Now if I type docker ps, you can see that the container is running. So this is really helpful because now I always have this container and I actually don't need to keep rerunning this command that actually defines the container and runs it. In VS Code, running that command, I'm going to attach to running container. So the new VS Code instance is starting up, activating extensions, doing all of its VS Code goodness. So that's working with Python. Now let's switch gears and take a look at the Go implementation. So I'm going to highlight the Go command, copy that, and bring that over to my terminal. I'm going to run that. With the Docker container running now, let's type docker ps again. And so now we can see that we have our Go and our Python one. If we go over to the Docker names, you can see Go and Python. Perfect. In VS Code, I'm going to do the command to attach to a running container. Starting up this dev container, you can see there's that installing that server. All right, so with the first things here, just want to check again that I have my Go extension installed. Just want to double check. All right, looks like it is installed. Great. Gonna go back. Also, my Copilot and GitLens are installed. Perfect. There are some Go dependencies here. We can install those. With those Go dependencies installed, now VS Code has what it needs to help us with our Go development. You can see now we have our IntelliSense available for the standard packages. With this Go instance now, let's start up this application. Gonna go to Go Docker file and find out what our command is. We're gonna do things a little bit differently because Go, it has the build command, as well as then after you build, you can run the executable or the binary. But Go also has a run command that we're actually going to use for our development purposes. So I'm going to type Go run, and that's in the Go directory, and it's main.go. So this application doesn't return anything to the terminal to indicate, but VSCode is smart enough to pick up and detect that we just opened up a port. So you can click on the open browser, and you can see now we have our Go container. And let's just double check that ID real quick. Back in the terminal, E4C 9BF, E4C 9BF, perfect. I want to make a similar modification and add that Esperanto path into Go as well. Again, I'm going to be using Copilot to help me build that out. Create func like handler, because handler is the function above, so I want to create a function that's similar to that one that returns Esperanto greeting if path is EO. And I'm gonna give it a hint because I didn't like what it was selecting there. And I'll hit tab. So this handler should be fine. Gonna take a look at, and it created this struct. It's got the Esperanto language. All right, let's give that a shot. Gonna go down here and add it. Actually, GitHub Copilot says you can add it in. I can add it in for you. Hit save. Now Go run doesn't automatically rebuild. So I'm gonna hit cancel and Go run again. Gonna run the original, and it looks like it's still returning hello world, great. And then I'm gonna add EO path. And now it's returning Esperanto as expected. Let's see if we add an S to this. Not found, perfect. So that's operating just how we want it to. So that's how we modify Go. I'm not going to go through the remaining 4 languages that are available in this repository, but you are welcome to do that on your own. What I'm going to do is now go back and run our Docker Compose on my workstation and show that these changes that were made in the containers actually took place on my workstation as well. I close the VS Code instances that were running through the dev containers, and I am on my workstation. But you can see that if I go to show me the changes, that this is on my local workstation and I have my changes that I made. I just want to run Docker Compose again. This is going to package up the applications and put them in the containers as they're defined in each of their respective Docker files. I'm going to start the terminal and paste in the command docker compose up build. I have my 6 implementations running. I'm going to open up Docker Compose because I want to look at the ports 8081. In my browser, going to go to 8081. All right, so that's base, and then EO should be on here. And there we go, perfect. Now 8082 is the node implementation, so that should not be available. Cannot get EO, perfect, but root should be fine. And then port 8083 is going to be our Go implementation. Hello world, looking good, and then just check for EO. So that's my demonstration of how to use dev containers with the docker-polyglot-world. I encourage you to download the repository and give it a try yourself. If you like this video and or you found it helpful, please give me a thumbs up and click on that subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this in the future. And thanks for watching.